So I will be presenting our data on the timing of basal insulin, and it's something that we've done a bit of work on lately. So these are my disclosures. So as you know, I mean, type 1 diabetes is a global, I would say, issue right now, and specifically in Saudi Arabia, we're in the top 10 countries with the incidence and prevalence of type 1 diabetes in children. And according to the latest Dar survey that was published last year, the population of type 1 diabetes that were quite large, and it showed us that fasting Ramadan in Saudi Arabia is almost the norm, with more than 90% of our participants saying that they do fast, and this was done during the COVID period. Now, if we compare the DAR Global Survey to the EPIDAR and the other surveys that were done on type 1 diabetes, you do find that it does represent the largest of all when it comes to the number of participants with type 1 diabetes. And it did show us that 26% of those patients are able to fast the whole month. So when we look further into the timing in where hypoglycemia mostly is reported, as expected and as what is already known, that is mostly over the last few hours prior to iftar time. However, when we looked into the data, dissecting it regionally, comparing Saudi Arabia to the other countries collectively, you could see that for some reason Saudi Arabia does have a little bit of a different peak towards the most common time of hypoglycemia, mainly being early on in the day, indicating that maybe in relation to different patterns of life and the basal might not be the main issue, and maybe that most of the hypoglycemias are happening more related to prandial insulins and sahur doses. So again, going back to what we have learned from CGM trials, that the trend towards the lower blood sugar is logically towards the latest hours of the day, and therefore the guidelines have consistently recommended that basal insulin should be taken earlier, in addition to the reduction of 15 to 30%. However, this recommendation hasn't been really based on randomized trials or a real testing of the difference of timing of giving insulin glargine. So let's dissect what is known so far. So if we look through some of the studies that were done experimentally on patients fasting on glargine, these are not Ramadan studies. So with Muka et al. In 2004, he had people fast for about 18 hours. In that study, the glargine was given at bedtime at 2200. They did not reduce the dose. And patients were actually requested to even walk for about 30 minutes twice a day, once in the morning and once in the afternoon. And this graph represents the mean blood sugar during the fast, the solid line, versus the days that they were not fasting. And this is the timing of glargine given here in 15 patients. And you can see that the sugar from, let's say, early morning at 7 a.m. to towards 5 p.m., just before the end of the fast, reduced from 125 to 93. However, there was no hypoglycemias. Now, in the other study by Vigorel, when he had patients with type 1 fast for 24 hours, again, here the glargine was given at bedtime and following the dinner and the prandial insulin. In this study, he had 13 patients on MDI. These are represented here by the solid line. And again, you can see that during the fast, yes, the blood sugar might go down a little bit towards the evening hours, but then again, it kind of like stabilizes there. So it doesn't really, again, give us any indication towards a certain timing that will be better than the other. So what about studies in Ramadan that have experimented with different dosing or timing with giving glargine. So we have the study by Dr. Alamoudi in 2010, where he had 12 fasting children compared to those who didn't fast. In his study, those who fasted, he had reduced the dose of the basal by about 20%, and it was given in the evening. And he reported that they fasted safely and there was no issues. But again, you can't really conclude much in regards to how does it compare to other timings. The study by Khawari et al. In 2010 compared conventional versus MDI. So he had 13 patients on MDI, the basal being glargine. In that study, the glargine was given again around bedtime, so 21 to 2200, and dose adjustment was not part of the protocol, so some had and some didn't. And then if you look into the actual numbers, so out of the 13 patients, 7 were able to fast without hypoglycemia, and out of those 7, 4 didn't have any dose adjustments and had no hypoglycemia, and only 3 had hypoglycemia that needed to be corrected by reducing the dose by about 8 to 16% to prevent further occurrences. So again, really small numbers, really weak evidence to suggest a certain protocol or a certain way of adjusting glargine. But the study by Dr.Reem Alamoudi in 2011, again, this was an interesting study. 33 patients, all on MDI. Just before Ramadan, everybody got switched to glargine and aspart at a ratio of 50-50. And then before Ramadan by a day, the total daily dose was reduced by 10%, 35% given as glargine, and 65% given as aspart. The rationale here being that there was more need for branded insulin at iftar. And it was given between 8 to 12 p.m., so not early. And what was noticed here is that the average blood sugar was really towards the hyperglycemic side, even during the fasting hours. And by the end of Ramadan, those initial reduction needed to be incremented by around 8%. And then we have the more recent studies that were done under continuous glucose monitoring. So you have the study by Effendi et al. In 2018, 25 patients on MDI. And in this study, they followed the Dar guidelines, I think the 2016 guidelines, by giving glargine at early, between 7 and 8 p.m., and reducing it by about 25 to 30%. And they commented that most hypoglycemias still were happening during the day hours between 10 a.m. and 7 p.m. But again, no comparison here to a later time of giving glargine to see if this would have changed. And then we have the study by Professor Asma, 65 patients on MDI and pump. And the conclusion in this study was that it didn't make really a difference changing the time of giving glargine. And there was the study by Dr. Ozeri et al. In 2019 that had both MDI and pump patients, again, on either flash monitoring or continuous monitoring. The intervention in that study was mainly related to education, and people were, participants were on basal either once a day or twice a day. Overall, the dose was reduced by 20%, and it was given at the same pre-Ramadan time. So who were taking glargine twice a day kept taking it twice a day, and those who were taking it once a day took it at the same time once a day. And again, they didn't find that timing made a huge difference. So that led us in 2019. We did a small crossover design of 19 patients who were on MDI glargine and under monitoring by flash glucose monitoring. And we had them take glargine at 7 p.m. and then they were crossed over after 2 weeks to 12 p.m. And we didn't really notice that it made a difference. So when it came to the hypoglycemia, the time in range, more the average A1C, there was no difference between the time that those patients were taking it at 7 p.m. or were taking it at bedtime. So all this led us to that it's really mandatory to have an answer to this question. And we did a randomized trial comparing early versus late administration of insulin glargine during fasting Ramadan. So our objectives were clearly looking at the effectiveness and safety of this time adjustment, and to really try to answer this question and fill this gap of knowledge. And mainly determining if taking glargine at 6 to 7 p.m. was associated with less hypoglycemia compared to bedtime timing. We also looked into other objectives like glucose variability, the number of days they needed to break their fast, overall glucose control, hyperglycemia, and other complications. And it was a multi-center, open-label, randomized trial, and between 4 cities in Saudi Arabia, all National Guard's medical cities, in Jeddah, Riyadh, Dammam, and Al Hassan. We included all patients who are 14 and above with type 1 diabetes for at least 6 months and who are committed to self-monitoring, and all ethical considerations and approvals were taken. So basically, patients before Ramadan had to fill out questionnaires, they got their labs done, and they got all the pre-Ramadan education, and they consented. Then they were randomized to taking glargine either at between 6 and 7 p.m. or between 10 and 12 p.m. And during Ramadan, everybody had to be monitored. All were on SMBG. Some were doing the SMBG using flash, and we had also a large group put the professional Envision iPro diagnostic CGM. And then after Ramadan, again, we did A1Cs, fructose means, downloaded all the data, filled post-Ramadan questionnaires. So mind you, this study was done in 2020 during really strict lockdowns. Patients were not allowed to go to their visits, and we had to collect a lot of this information virtually and by phone. So what did we find? So totally, we had randomized 206 patients with type 1 diabetes, 105 to taking glargine early, and 101 to taking it bedtime or late. And after some withdrawals, we ended up with 91 in the early group and 94 in the late group, giving a total population size of 185. Now, at baseline, our average age was 22. About 30% of our patients were adolescents below the age of 18, and the male-female ratio was more or less about 50-50. The average duration of diabetes was 10 to 12 years, average BMI about 24, no much complications, and the average daily glargine dose was 24 to 27. At baseline, patients did report some frequent hypoglycemia. It was about 36% in the early group, 44% in the late group, with an average about twice a week. And a small percentage also had hypoglycemia unawareness, about 6% to 8%. And the baseline A1C was 9 in the early group and 8.75 in the late group. Now, of course, we can't talk about basal without talking about the daily patterns. So, given that it was during the COVID restriction, no schools, working from home, you could see that the sleeping hours were basically from dawn till noon till even afternoon, with no much activity happening except after 9 p.m. or after Isha prayers. And this is the average blood glucose as measured by the Envision iPro. So blue here is representing the early group, and yellow is representing the late group. And you could see again the same, that the sugar tends to go lower just towards the midday and then picks up after iftar. Here, because not everybody had the Envision, so I combined here the data of the Libri and the iPro to present a larger population. And again, more or less we see the same, and it was not significantly different between the early and late group. And this is time in range. So again, just like what we heard in the previous lecture, a lot of hyperglycemia. Time above range is exactly 47.5% in both. Time within range was only 46%. Time below range was a little bit trending toward being better in those who took the glargine late, but the p-value was not significant. so 6.4% versus 7.9%. And if we look into the time in range data differently, looking into the percentage of patients who actually achieved the targets, so those who achieved a target time below range less than 4%, again, we see a trend towards a little bit better or more patients in the late group achieving a time below range less than 4%, 52% versus 41%. But again, the p-value was not significant, and it wasn't much different for the time above range and time in range. So this table summarizes the data of the SMBG and Libri, and again, you could see the average glucose around 184 versus 179. The variability not really different. Number of hypoglycemic events average about 4 in the early group versus 3 in the late group. And if we look into the CGM, the estimated GIM or A1C during the week that it was on was 7.9 for the early group, 8.3 for the late group. If we look at it into those who had an A1C less than 7 versus above 7, it was about 32% in the early group versus 34% in the late group. Variability was not that different. And again, we see the same trend when it comes to the lows. So the low excursions of less than 70 were more here in the early versus the late. And the area under the curve for time below limit, again, was higher in the early versus the late. And if we look into the average duration spent above, in, or below range throughout the day, and looking specifically at the midday pre-iftar time, again, you would notice that the trend was towards a little bit better time below range during these specific times in the late glycemic group. Now, what about the number of days they need to break the fast? More or less the same, about 4. The reasons, mainly hypoglycemia. But again, we see something here interesting, that more people in the early glycemic group reported breaking their fast due to hyperglycemia, close to 30% compared to the late group. The time of self-reported hypoglycemia requiring discontinuation of fast, again, we see the same as what I showed you earlier in the regional data, that more people did break their fast because of hypos more early in the morning rather than later afternoon or pre-breakfast. So again, indicating that probably the basal has nothing to do with it here. Now, what about the overall pre- and post-Ramadan blood sugar control? Didn't really differ that much. Overall, the post-Ramadan A1C was better than the pre-Ramadan A1C. It was not significantly different between early versus late. And everybody lost weight after Ramadan, average 2 to 3 kilos. So, conclusions of our study. I think it shows that taking basal insulin glargine at 6 p.m. or early, as recommended by the Dar guidelines, doesn't really seem to carry any advantage when it comes to the incidence of hypoglycemia compared to bedtime of 10 to 12. And if anything, the observed trend was in favor of bedtime. However, as it was not statistically significant, and there were more significant hyperglycemic events leading to breakage or discontinuation of the fast in those who took glargine early. Most hypoglycemic events requiring discontinuation of the fast happened during the early hours, and there was no significant difference in general between early versus late in relation to glucose control, glucose variability, number of days overall that the fast need to be broken, or acute complications. In both groups, about 25% were able to fast the full 30 days, again coinciding with what was the findings of the DAR survey. And fasting did not further deteriorate blood sugar control and was associated with weight loss in both groups. So the major strength, I think, that this is the first relatively large size, about 200 patients, a randomized study comparing the timing of basal insulin in relation to fasting. And however, again, it doesn't seem that the power was enough to detect statistical significance and it is limited generalizability to the Saudi population who may have a certain way of life and practices during Ramadan that might not apply to Muslim patients in other parts of the world. And my overall take-home message is, I don't think there's any advantage of changing basal insulin timing to early evening in regards to safety of fasting. And I concur with Dr. Reed mentioned in his first lecture that I think the most important factor is the type 1 diabetes itself, and individualization is what's needed. The ideal fasting regimen is really yet to be found, and it will depend on inherent factors in different patients. And we definitely need more randomized trials investigating different doses, different timings, distribution, nutrition relation to prandial and all that to achieve best fasting outcomes in our patients. And with that, I acknowledge everybody who contributed to this research, and thank you very much.